Hi, everyone. This is Edie from Xica Media, Xica Nation, here doing a very special interview today, sharing the good work and the good palabra of the hermana Michelle Angela Ortiz, who is an award-winning artist and muralist out in Pennsylvania. Hi, Michelle. Welcome.
Hi, Edie. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for opening the space for me to share my work.
Yes, no, we're very excited to have you. So today we wanted to talk about the Familias Separadas project and just the work in general that you're doing around family detention there in Pennsylvania. And just a second ago, you and I were talking offline, and you were mentioning a really critical point, which is that when we think about the border, when we think about family detention, when we think about the Central Americans and coming up, we are thinking about the southern border. We're thinking about the Southwest. We're thinking about, a very Mexican cultural context in terms of geography. But here you are up in the Northeast, encountering the same issues, helping folks that are incarcerated, children, mothers that are imprisoned up in Pennsylvania. And that's just, it's mind blowing and it's mind boggling because we don't think about that when we think about the border. But the border affects people physically, metaphorically, all across the country. So, could you tell us a little bit more about the Familias Separadas project you have going and about basically what's going on up there in the Northeast around the issue?
Yeah, so the Familias Separadas project emerged. The idea of it came to me in 2013 after I had already been doing another project called the Aquí y Allá mural project, and I was working at that time with youth, some of them across the border as unaccompanied youth. Some were just being reunited with some uncles or other siblings here, or some crossed to then be reunited with their parents. Most of the kids that participated in this project, meaning there were like about 8 to 12 youth here in Philadelphia, were coming specifically from Puebla, from San Mateo Solco, from Tlaxcala, and Domingo Arenas. And these were the three locations in which the majority of Mexican immigrant families were crossing and coming to Philadelphia. And what you see too is that a lot of the families, the Poblanos, are also dispersed out within New Jersey and New York. So that project was something that Aquí y Allá came also because I worked with youth in Juarez and Chihuahua City with in partnership with two other artist collectives in Juarez called Resiste and another one called Colectivo Madroño. These two groups were graffiti artists that I had the pleasure of connecting with as a United States cultural envoy doing work in Mexico and in other places throughout Central and South America and also in Mexico. So the work was really centered around creating large-scale murals and most importantly, training local artists in building their toolbox and figuring out how to create large-scale works, but that has a really in-depth community engagement component to it. So I was able to raise enough funds to bring some of those artists to Philadelphia, give them the same opportunity I had to go to their country, and begin to work with me with the students here in Philadelphia and also the students that were in the border towns. So there were two high schools that were selected in Juarez and Chihuahua City. These majority of those students were coming from families who attempted to cross the border and stayed stuck in the border, in La Frontera. And so they also talk about because they're coming from indigenous communities, because they're coming from an interior, they're also dealing with a lot of discrimination within the border towns of Mexico that their families continue to face. They've also had family members that have either crossed or they attempted to cross, or their parents were successful in crossing and they had to stay behind. So the intention of that work was really to talk about the dynamic or the impact of immigration on the family. And one of the main things it was out of the Aquí y Allá project which resulted in a small documentary and this mural that's still here in South Philadelphia, was to really give the space to a lot of the youth to talk about what it meant to cross, what it meant, you know, for them to actually create a safe space and say, I want to be back in Mexico, right? Without having their parents place any judgment on them, right? Because I think that that's the other thing, being like the pressure of being a child of immigrants, which I am a child of immigrants. It's this thought of like, you know, you want to make sure that your parents feel proud of you, that you don't take their sacrifices in vain, that they understand that you're grateful. And so, you know, it can seem ungrateful if they say, I would like to be back with my grandmother. I want to be back with, you know, to the place that I've left behind. So it allowed for that space for several of the students to really talk about that. And then eventually we created this huge 70-foot long mural in South Philadelphia. And it's really important where it is and where it's situated, because in a growing Mexican and Central American community, there is a lack of visual representation. So to have this image of Diana, to have this image and messages of, we were able to capture on the wall messages from the students, that, and then also messages from the students in Mexico. They painted on this polyester fiber, and then it was mailed back to us in Philadelphia and installed. So it's a transnational mural. But Familias Separadas emerged from this project. I always say one project leads me to the next, because we talked about the impact of immigration. We talked about not only are these teens dealing with puberty, first of all, but they're also dealing with learning a new language, going to a new school, navigating through a new city that doesn't look anything like where they come from. And then above all of that, reestablishing a relationship with their parents, reestablishing this relationship. Their parents view them as the 5-month-old or the 3-year-old that they left behind. And the children are trying to rebuild this love and support that they're trying to regain, you know, by coming back. So you add all of that. So all of that pressure. And what popped out from some of the conversations was that the young lady who's featured in the mural, Diana, who lives a few blocks away from the mural, she talked about how that her father was deported throughout the conversation. So I thought, oh my gosh, like, not only have these beautiful children gone through all of this, and now you add deportation into the mix. So that was all happening, the rise of deportation. We had raids happening where I live, specifically in South Philadelphia. It's a large immigrant community. I live a block just down the block of my house. There's the oldest outdoor market, which has a history of immigrant families that have worked there selling produce. And I had a neighbor who was taken out of his house and slammed against the wall by ICE agents while his 3-year-old daughter looked and saw what was happening. And so this is something that was very present and kind of, in a sense, increased in 2013 here in my city. And I felt that, you know, it was necessary to talk about that, you know, and to talk about, you know, the impact of detention and deportations within the different families here in Philadelphia. So I started Familias Separadas during that time. And in 2015 was when I unveiled the first phase of the installations. I worked directly with Juntos, which is an immigrant rights organization here in Philadelphia. And by working with Juntos, I was able to connect with some of the 5 families that were featured in the project. There was everything I do is very in-depth. So I go through a process of meeting with the families, sharing what my intentions are, having them really understand how the story would be told or shown, and then going through a process with them to see how they want to share their story. And then they're able to hear their story before it goes out public, see the images before it goes out, so that they feel that they're best represented in the way that they feel comfortable with. So I would say the two standout installations that came out of the five was one huge installation called Eres Mi Todo, where you have the image of Maria and her daughter, and it was placed in the center point of our city, where there is this compass, and on this compass rose by Edmund Bacon, that was placed in the center of our city, because that's how our city is mapped out. In City Hall, you see the image of Maria and her daughter. Eres Mi Todo comes from the letters of her husband Jose when he was detained in California for 3 years, attempting to come back to be reunited with his family. And Maria talks about the difficulty, excuse me, of the difficulty of trying to make a decision if she would return back to Mexico to be with her husband after he was eventually deported, or to remain here in the United States. She has several children, 5 kids that some are mixed statuses. So some are undocumented, others are US citizens because they were born here in the city. And so, you know, the challenge of her being a single mother and raising these children, and the difficulty of now not having her husband by her side. So the concept was to create an 18-foot diameter of her image and place it in the center of our city, as we have all of these symbols of democracy and freedom. We have the image of the quotations founding fathers and Benjamin Franklin, and we a few blocks away there's the Liberty Bell, there's the Declaration of Independence. And so what does Maria's story mean within that context, right? And how important it was to center her story in the center of our city, in a very public space where most people would either ignore or not know, or are completely disconnected with this story, right? That it impacts our city. There are close to 50,000 undocumented immigrants in the city of Philadelphia, and so I felt that was important to place her there. The other standout piece was the piece that I did at the Immigration Customs Enforcement building. This was in front of the ICE building on 16th and Callow Hill, where we actually installed a 90-foot long stencil with community members, both undocumented families and allies and lawyers and organizers and activists. And we were able to install the words, "We're human beings risking our lives for our families and our future," in front of this ICE building, which is actually one of the most aggressive ICE buildings, ICE agencies here in the United States. It has the highest number of non-criminal arrests. It has jurisdiction in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and that's the first point of detention in our state. And so, and in their jurisdiction. So what you see there is this huge stencil that was created and placed at the exit point, where loved ones are then moved to prisons or jails to continue their detention and possible deportation. And then what I was able to do, excuse me, was organize everyone to be able to do this huge installation. And what I always talk about in terms of a moment, this was a moment that was like a climax in my artistic career, because, you know, people usually see the final product and they really don't necessarily see the process. And what I felt was really powerful was I was able to work with everyone together, standing in front of this building that represented so much fear for a lot of the undocumented families there, and they were fearless in placing the stencil on the ground. So the words that you see there are actually coming from an interview that Juntos conducted of one of the mothers that was detained inside. Her name is Ana. She's from Guatemala. And she was detained at the Berks Detention Center. And that's when I was learning about what was happening at Berks in 2015. And during that time frame, there were 14 mothers that had already been detained for about 1.5 years, going on to 2 years. These were women who who organized hunger strikes and labor strikes, wrote campaign letters. This was all happening during this time, and so that's when I understood and knew that for the second phase of Familias Separadas, I wanted to focus it on the stories of these 14 mothers.
Wow, that's incredible. What a background, but it's critical knowledge. It's so because I think that you really share two things really come to mind for me and really stand out about this. One is the process of working with the community, not speaking for them,
No.
not being not being a mouthpiece for them, um, actually incorporating them to every step of the process, coming and working with a community in crisis with humility, with dignity, and allowing them to mold the final product, and have a say in that. And that's something that we don't see even in all the news reporting that's happening with the Central American caravan that's coming up north. Like, they're never allowed to speak for themselves. There's always an opinion, there's always someone else talking. So thank you so much for sharing that story, because as media makers, it's really important that we always center the folks that are in crisis and let them speak for themselves. But
Absolutely.
the other point that just it stands out to me also is, again, this notion that you're really far from the southern border, and yet this issue's directly, dramatically, violently affecting
Yes.
folks all the way up in the Northeast. Um, could you tell us a little bit about what like, we got a sense of the reaction from the folks as they were, incorporated into the process of the artwork, but what about the public? What was the public response to these very public works?
Um, Still to this day, there are people that live in our state and they do not even know that there is a family prison that detains and incarcerates children as young as 9 weeks old and their mothers and fathers. And so I felt that with Familias Separadas, at least with the first phase, was to bring more consciousness around this issue in our city of Philadelphia. Um, to put at the forefront with each one of these pieces. So every presentation that I gave, I always shared a snippet of an audio of either Maria or Suyapa or Cruz speaking on firsthand. If they were comfortable, I would ask them to come join me in these discussions. And I think that also takes a lot of just courage, but also I'm careful in knowing, I think one thing that I try to, the good thing about doing video and the good thing about doing audio and creating visuals is that you're able to tell the story over and over and over again in as many ways as you can. And I think what I have found and what I try to also take really good care of is that the families and the individuals that are featured in these works don't have to continue to tell their story over and over and over again, because just that simple act is re-traumatizing them. So when I say that I handle those situations with care, obviously I want them to be at the forefront and sharing their stories. But I also understand that by doing that 10 times, 20 times, you're just reliving everything that you're trying to overcome, and so I find that that's been really useful in the work that I'm doing. And in terms of the Northeast and what does this mean is that so the majority of the families that have arrived here, so I should say for Familias Separadas, the majority of the families that arrived here came through either Arizona, or they came up via Juarez and Chihuahua City through El Paso, and then coming up to Philadelphia. Almost everyone already had a loved one and a family member here. And that's how they were able to connect with one another. in the case of the majority of the mothers so as I mentioned, there were 14 mothers that were detained at the Berks Detention Center. Almost every family that arrived to Berks, which is 1 out of 3 family prisons in the United States, now that's being expanded by all of these detention camps that are popping out in Texas and in different parts of the country that we actually don't even know about, because the government is trying to hide that from us. But there are 3 family prisons, which is Kearney, Dilley, which are in Texas, and they're run by private companies. And then there's the Berks. The official title is called the Berks County Residential Center. And the reason why it's called Berks County is because it is a county-run detention center, which means that the county, which is about a few minutes away from Reading, one of the poorest cities that we have in our state, this detention center earns $1.3 million in federal funds in incarcerating these families. And the pressure of the community partner for this phase 2 of my project, which is the Shut Down Berks Coalition, they have been fighting, first of all, the license, because there's been a list of human rights abuses reported by ACLU and the Human Rights Watch that has shown records of lack of medical attention, inadequate educational programming, just constant harassment of the mothers and the fathers and the children. If they don't abide by the rules, they're always threatened about being separated by their children. Just a very simple thing of having your toddler want to sleep with you in your bed, and you can't do that. They have to sleep in separate beds. So imagine this. I can't even imagine it as my child pops into my bed every night. And so the fact that he's in a room or in a space where he doesn't feel safe and he can't even be with his mother or father because they'll be threatened and being separated. So this is what's happening, and much worse. There was another mother who was raped by a guard. And the penalty really fell more on the mothers inside than the guard that just got a suspension. The mothers then there was a dress code issued that the mothers couldn't wear tight clothing, as if they were the reason why the one mother was raped by the guard. There was another report of a young little girl, a toddler who was vomiting blood, and the on-staff doctor had told the mother to just give her water. And she didn't receive or see a real doctor until 2 days later. This and many more things are happening. So a lot of the mothers are crossing. They are then detained at either Kearney or Dilley. They spend either a week or a few days there, and then they're moved to the Berks Family Prison here in Pennsylvania. So some of them have already gone through some of the other prisons on the border to then arrive at Berks. The reason why they arrive at Berks is because most of them have families around the Northeast area. And so the intention is that they arrive at Berks, they're supposed to be detained for just a few weeks, and then they're placed with their families and continue to fight their asylum cases or fight against their deportation cases. In the case of these 14 mothers, the 14 mothers were detained for close to 2 years with their children. And they had fought, as I mentioned, every step of the way. Now, we have in the United States, which now the current administration is trying to get rid of, which is called the Flores Act. The Flores Act means that no child should be detained for more than, I believe, 28 days. They've already broken the law with all of the families that are detained at the Berks Detention Center. The human rights abuses should be crystal clear that they should have their license revoked, and they don't have the capacity to treat the families the way they should be treated. And although all those things have happened, the detention center continues to function and continues to operate. As I mentioned, it's a county-run prison, which means the Shutdown Burkes Coalition has been fighting within these past 3 years in putting pressure on Governor Tom Wolf, which is our current governor, who is a Democrat. And he's had the power for 4 years to be able to issue an emergency release order, which means he can release the families who then can go to their families within their respective areas here in the Northeast. They can continue to fight their asylum cases. They can continue to fight against the deportation. But their children are going to school. Their children are able to be free, right? And as their parents continue to fight through this, and they're not incarcerated. And so what has happened is that he has failed to do this emergency release order, and he continues to tell people he can't do anything about it, which is completely false. And that he has the power. The law is on his side for him to be able to do that. So by removing these families, currently there are 30 families, mostly fathers with young children, that are detained at the Burkes Detention Center. The 14 mothers that I spoke about so I visited the mothers starting March 2017. In August 2017, so last summer, between that time frame, 10 of the 14 mothers were deported back to El Salvador and Honduras after they were detained for those 2 years and returning back to the same conditions that they were fleeing from in the first place. And then the 4 remain here in the United States. They were released, but they remain in the United States. 3 out of the 4 that are here in the US in different cities, they're no longer in the state of Pennsylvania, are featured in the second phase of Familias Separadas. And 1, who is Karen, and her son Steven, represents 1 out of the 10 mothers that were deported back to El Salvador, and she's featured in the project. The image that you see, there's a huge 88-foot-long installation that I did, and I covered, this is the first time anything like this happened in the Capitol. I covered the Capitol steps with the image of Karen and Steven, and the intention was because the policymakers, because the people in the center feel that the issue or the problem has been resolved because they've done away with these women and they've released them or deported them. What I wanted to do with this project was to bring their stories back, and not just bring them back any place, but bring them back to the center of our state and at the very steps of the people in power that can shut down the center. So you see the image of Karen and Steven. Steven had 2 suicide attempts while he was at Burkes. This also happened with many other children that were detained there. He was only 6 years old. And so Karen was one of the mothers that was at the forefront of these hunger strikes and labor strikes, and is still very vocal in the artworks and in the videos, because there's small videos that accompany each piece. You can hear firsthand the stories of the mothers. She is the only mother that you see full face, because she doesn't run she's not fearful of being deported. She doesn't have the fear of ICE looming over her. The other 3 mothers are still fighting against their deportation. Just a few months ago, so almost over a full year, they had to wear probation bracelets. They still have to have ICE come to their home every week, and they still have to report to ICE every month. And every interaction with ICE is always, we can deport you. You're not supposed to be here. So the fear is still very constant as they try to navigate and survive being outside of the center and deal with the trauma that that's been inflicted by being detained, but also the trauma that their children are dealing with. So I feel that, with the Familias Separadas, there's a total of there's the installation at the Capitol steps. There's a total of 8 installations. There are billboards, there are bus shelters that surround the Capitol. There's also a huge permanent mural in Allison Hill, where there's a thriving immigrant community that has been especially targeted within these past 2 to 3 years, with ICE raids and state police coming in and actually detaining them. So it's a target, and so I felt that the mural, amongst all the other pieces that feature the stories of the mothers, is still a mother featured, but it's talking about the love that she has for her child. And there's a phrase in Spanish that's painted that says, "Mi hijo es el único que me da fuerza." My son is the only one that gives me strength. And so, how important it is throughout, obviously, sharing these messages and sharing these stories that are very hard to hear, because this is happening not just to them, but continues to happen within, not just in Berks, but all these other detention centers. What we're dealing with is this attack. And so it's really important that amongst the imagery that I'm pushing out, that there's also an image within our community that is uplifting, and within our community that shows how resilient and how powerful we are, in the midst of all of these attacks that are happening directly towards us.
That's so powerful. What can the public do? What can we do to support this work and to support the community there in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things for the people that live in Pennsylvania. Obviously, there's a link that I can share with you, that gives some more in-depth information about Berks, including these reports of the human rights abuses that have happened. It's extremely important that the governor hears. We have elections tomorrow. I feel that his response recently has been, well, just vote for me and I'll make the change that you want. But recently, he's had 4 years and he hasn't done anything. But it's important for those that can vote, obviously, to vote, and to also have. We have the Shut Down Berks Coalition has done a great job in providing information on how people can support. We just had a huge statewide action on Saturday that was then followed by the celebration of the mural. And so one thing is there are lobby visits, there are campaign letter writings, there are direct calls into the offices of the representatives that can make this change. And then, the last thing, which I can share this information with you, is also donations. At this point, what is necessary for this movement is, like, one is, again, the constituents within Pennsylvania to be able to take action. And I can send you the link in how to do that through the Shut Down Berks Coalition. There is, besides folks from Pennsylvania, on a broader perspective, wider perspective, is to be able to make donations. And I can also send you a link that's through the Free Migration Project. That is one of the organizations within the Shut Down Berks Coalition, because there are sometimes actions that happen and then civil disobedience, arrest. And so it helps to either A, pay those fines, or B, help with transportation. There are monthly vigils that happen in front of the Berks Detention Center, and the mothers have spoken about how important it was to see people there, to hear chants, to know that there's other people on the other side supporting them. And so it's necessary that that work continues to happen. So I've been directing people to make donations to the Shut Down Berks Coalition to support their work. And on a larger scale, as I mentioned, in terms of the larger immigration narrative, I mean, I talk about it as people just think this is an isolated, siloed immigration issue. This is a child welfare issue. This is a women's rights issue. This is a labor issue. The mothers earn $1 a day cleaning the very center that incarcerates them. And this is a mass incarceration issue. This falls into the larger problem of mass incarceration. And so, so I'm pushing out these videos, I'm pushing out, obviously, the messages through the artwork. And the intention, I hope, is that we continue to push them out, especially the videos of the mothers What I'm hoping is that within these next few months, I'll be working with a video editor, and we'll have a 10 to 15-minute documentary. The intention for the documentary is to showcase the extended interviews of the mothers, along with the production of the artwork, and then utilize that piece to be able to do community screenings all throughout the state of Pennsylvania, um, and utilize the film as a way to do a panel discussion to really talk about the issues. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow for the election. We don't know who is going to be in power. So whomever it is, we still have to continue the fight. And so what I hope is that this work moves not just within Pennsylvania, but outside of that too, right? And so really think about how telling this story can also connect with what's happening in Brownsville, what's happening in Tornillo, what's happening right now in New York. So I would like to think of ways to just continue to push out the narrative, to push out the stories, to push out the messages of the mothers. So looking for spaces and opportunities to do that would also be helpful, because we can still continue to talk about this issue and inform people and lead people in a way to take action.
For those that have been following along, we're going to include all of these links, links to the videos, links to the artwork here within the blog post below the video. And we're asking for your support. You know, get in touch with the Shutdown Burks Coalition, get in touch with Michelle, get in touch with us here at Xica Nation. Together is how we're gonna defeat this beast. It's so overwhelming, and it's intimidating, but each of us, wherever we are positioned, have something to offer, and each of us has different forms of privilege that we can use and leverage to support the communities in crisis that are experiencing this horrific just system of abuses. Thank you so much, Michelle, for taking the time to talk to us. Please know that if there's anything you need to share, any upcoming stories, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to share it to our folks. And for those of you who tuned in, thank you so much for listening. We'll keep you posted. Again, check the links in the bottom. And thanks very much.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you. Xica Media. Woo!
All right.
Seguimos en la lucha.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.